Okay, now to get to the fun part of the evening. So the following is a live presentation, and recording is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks that viewers do the same. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Okay. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Eleanor Breen, who is the city archaeologist of the City of Alexandria, Virginia. Hopefully nobody thought they were coming about Alexandria, Egypt. This is just actually more interesting. So Dr. Breen earned her bachelor's degree in anthropology from the College of William and Mary, a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and a doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She's authored or co-authored dozens of publications and conference presentations on the historical archaeology. Might be wrong. Primarily, I would say Virginia. Have you gone on mostly Virginia? Okay, Maryland too. Yeah, but mostly that part of the world. She has served as the president of the Council of Virginia Archaeologists and is recognized on the National Register of Professional Archaeologists. Dr. Breen worked for years at George Washington's Mount Vernon, rising up to be deputy director of the archaeology program there before she moved to the City of Alexandria Archaeology Department. She currently directs this renowned public archaeology program, a museum that preserves and interprets the buried history of the city of Alexandria, Virginia. She's a specialist in historical archaeology of colonial Virginia, focusing on urban archaeology, the archaeology of the African diaspora, material culture studies, and digital humanities. Now, normally I would turn over to the speaker right now, but I have one more slide. Way back in the summer of 2002, I got my first paid job in archaeology at George Washington's Mount Vernon. I was a field archaeologist learning how to take all the information I had learned in the classroom into practice. This website from the AIA, this is the interactive dig of us digging George Washington's whiskey distillery. It is still live. They must have just put a really good deposit down for this website that it's still live. And the reason I'm showing you this is because Eleanor was my first boss at that job. Yep. And I worked there for about a year, and she was one of my first bosses in archaeology. She taught me so much about field archaeology, working with the public, and how to work in this unique field as a professional. She taught me the joys of working collaboratively with archaeologists to investigate a site, and a lot about public education. Mount Vernon had a really big push for public education. I think she taught me a lot about that so she could push me to talk to the tourists rather than her having to do it as much. But that was great fun. And it feels like full circle. We are now thousands of miles away from Virginia. We both now have our PhDs. We're both doing archaeology still. And I'm still as excited as ever to learn from her. So very much looking forward to tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eleanor Breen.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you to the AIA for the invitation to come today. I'm really very excited to share a little East Coast archaeology with all of you, East Coast as in Alexandria, Virginia. And yeah, I really, I do remember very clearly asking Brian to do a lot of the interpretation when we were doing archaeology behind the mansion's kitchen. It's where the tour lets out. If you've ever gone through Mount Vernon, you see the smokehouse, you go through the main building, and then you come out through the kitchen, and there the archaeologists were. So we were doing the whiskey distillery, but we were also digging right behind the kitchen. And we were the first point of contact of thousands of school-aged kids who come and experience Mount Vernon every year. And the first thing they see after they've gone through the tour is history happening before their eyes. And they had a million questions. Most of them, are you digging dinosaur bones? If you find something, it's mine. I left it. You know, just trying to get the conversation started. And Brian was always really good at sort of taking that initial bit of humor, those jokes, and turning it into an educational experience for those thousands of school kids. So I always have appreciated that about him. Okay, let me just go ahead and get started now. So I wanted to start off by saying, meet Alexandria. Alexandria is a city that's 5 miles south of Washington, D.C. So we are considered part of Northern Virginia, but we're an independent city. We're 10 miles north of George Washington's home at Mount Vernon, very close by, just a drive down the historic parkway. Our city is 16 square miles, and I say our city because I'm a resident of Alexandria as well. So I've worked there for almost 10 years, and I also live about a mile away from our museum. We have about 160,000 residents. We have one public high school where over 125 languages, native languages, are spoken. So we're a very diverse region, and we're a very urban residential area. And of course, there is at least 13,000 years of history within Alexandria. And I just wanted to show you this panel to give you a little bit of sense of Indigenous history in Alexandria. I'm a historical archaeologist, so I mainly focus on the 1607 period up into the modern times. But we are the stewards of 30 archaeological sites related to Virginia Indians within the city's 16 square miles. And in Virginia, there are 11 state and 7 federally recognized tribes. And this is one of our exhibit panels, actually, that you're seeing on the screen right now in our museum, where we encourage people to learn about the federally and state recognized tribes, including the Nottoway, the Chickahominy Eastern Division, the Mattaponi, the Upper Mattaponi, the Monacan, the Nansemond, the Nottoway, the Pamunkey, the Patawamak, and the Rappahannock. And you can see the location of their headquarters today on the map of Virginia in relationship to Alexandria and in relationship to the native languages that were spoken. So Alexandria, I'm just going to give you the most broadest strokes of the history of our city. Many people know Alexandria because they consider it to be George Washington's hometown. He traveled there often. He owned land in Alexandria. He visited taverns, played the lottery, undertook a very large amount of business transactions with the merchants there. So Alexandria is mentioned many, many times in George Washington's writings and diaries. And so that's a very strong connection that the city has as it comes to history. And in fact, I'm going to use the laser pointer here. This map that you see in the upper right-hand corner, we're going to see that a few times over the course of this talk tonight. That is a map that's drawn by George Washington in 1749 when he was a surveyor, right after as the town was being founded. And you can see that he's put all the street grids, and the map was recording the auction. So the individuals that were purchasing those parcels in the city. He shows our relationship to the Potomac River that he documents there. And also this crescent-shaped bay topographic feature of Alexandria. These are kind of like the mud flats or the tidal flats, maybe about 5 feet deep when the tide was in. So he's putting that on the map as well as a major geographic feature of the original town of Alexandria. We are also, as of the early 1790s, part of the federal district. So part of Washington, D.C. We were Alexandria, D.C. You can see Alexandria is located down here on the map. And this is the federal district. And we're part of the federal district until the 1840s, when we are retroceded back to Virginia, back to the state of Virginia. I point this out because it makes doing history and historical archaeology very complicated in Alexandria. Sometimes we have to go to Fairfax County to look for our records. Sometimes we have to go to Arlington, which is just the municipality north of us, Washington, D.C., and then within Alexandria's court records as well. So it's a confusing place to do research. We're also known for our implication in the Civil War. So Alexandria becomes a Union-occupied federal territory during the war. All of the buildings and many of the people, a newspaper reporter mentions, are being put to 1,000 uses of war. So the Union Army really takes over Alexandria. So we see a lot of remnants of the Civil War on the Alexandria landscape and within the built environment. Like many port cities, we become heavy industrialized in the 20th century. There's fertilizer factories, shipbuilding businesses, and lots of other unpleasant activities generating some toxic material. So that's part of our history as well, all the way up until today. And today, Alexandria economy is based a lot on cultural heritage tourism. There was a recent survey of people who came to visit Alexandria, and they said they were coming for history, culture, and for a unique history experience. And we were listed as one of the 50 best places to travel in Travel and Leisure magazine in the world. So alongside some of those other really prominent cities. And that's because Alexandria is really a history forward city, and its residents see that as part of their identity, is the history of the city and of the surrounding area. So I also want to bring in a little bit about where archaeology sits within the city. So we're actually part of of the local government. We're part of the City of Alexandria's government. I operate a division of the Office of Historic Alexandria. So this is a museum system and a department of the City of Alexandria that operates 7 museums and historic sites, 8 historic sites throughout the city. So we tell a lot of different types of history, focusing on different people and events and time periods. You'll see an image from the apothecary shop, which dated to the late 18th century. There's cemeteries that we manage and steward in partnership with descendants of people buried there. We also keep the city's archives. So all of those town minutes going back into the 1740s, we have all of those records. And then also a lot of history-inspired parks. Like I said, the Alexandria Archaeology Division is part of the Office of Historic Alexandria, and I usually talk about it as a unique urban archaeology program, where our core mission are the 3 C's. That's code, community, and collections. So what has stood Alexandria out from other cities, at least as of the late 1980s, is that we have an Archaeological Protection Code. And this becomes important in just a few slides. I'm not going to go into all the intricacies of it, but let me simply just say that archaeology is part of the development process at the local level in Alexandria. We review all new construction plans and make a determination about whether archaeology or historical study needs to happen in advance of private development. So this isn't federally funded projects or permitted projects. This is projects that are happening at the local level. So that's part of my job. The additional part of my job is this idea of community, that we're a community archaeology program. I was saying at dinner tonight that our closest partners, they're down in the middle here, are our Alexandria Archaeological Commission. They are 15 residents appointed by our mayor and city council to advocate and advise our elected officials on issues of preservation and archaeology. So that's pretty unique. And we also work with numerous stakeholder groups throughout the city, civic associations, descendant groups, school groups. We do a lot of lessons, archaeology lessons, science lessons for students in Alexandria. And we have a museum on the 3rd floor of the Torpedo Factory. How many people have been to Old Town Alexandria? Okay, great. So I definitely see a show of hands. That means you probably were in Old Town and you may have gone to the Torpedo Factory, which is an old munitions building and became an artist studio in the 1970s. And our archaeology museum is in there. And then the 3rd C is our role as stewards of a collection of 3 million artifacts from over 250 sites that have been registered just within that small 16 square miles. And so we have some of those. We have probably a very minor fraction of that 3 million in our museum and in a small storage space in our museum, but the vast majority of them are at an offsite storage collections facility. And we keep them for future research and education and in perpetuity. So we're a big curator of history in Alexandria. I also like to point out, this is one of our new exhibit panels in our museum, and it faces the outside so that it can be seen even when our museum is not open. And I always like to point out that I had to get my kids to stage them for a photo op because we needed a picture of somebody pointing to an archaeology exhibit in the city. So there's my kid standing there. Our museum also functions as public laboratory. So that's what you see in the bottom image there. You can come to our museum a few times a week and you'll be able to see archaeologists and volunteers working side by side to process artifacts kind of in the heart of the museum. So it's a very hands-on activity. Oh, and actually I should point out, this is a archaeological cultural resource management firm that does a lot of work in Alexandria. And that's one of the places that Brian worked after he worked at Mount Vernon. So definitely coming full circle here. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I wanted to introduce a few questions that I'll seek to answer this evening about these recent discoveries that have happened along the waterfront in Alexandria. So we're going to talk a little bit about the historical significance of these discoveries, what exactly was found when archaeologists did work along our historic waterfront. How did this happen? What did we learn? And I'll end with what's next. Okay, so we're going to go back to George Washington's 1749 map of Alexandria and examine it a little bit more closely. So as we talked about, there's the Potomac River to the east. There are two points of land that stick out on either side of the crescent-shaped bay. And the archaeological work that I'm going to be talking about occurred down here on the south portion. So tonight's topic is not a shipwreck lecture. The ships that I'm going to be talking about were not sailing and sunk in some catastrophic event filled with treasure. I want to dispel any myths. I'm going to be talking about workaday ships that were actually used as part of Alexandria's land filling process. So I'm going to be talking about land making and maritime history, about our connection to mercantilism, about an economy based on the enslavement of people, and a story about a Revolutionary War era port city, and a story about how one city has undertaken a very challenging project to study and preserve 4 ship hull remnants that were found along the edge of the waterfront. So our story begins in 1749 when George Washington makes this map. The years I'll be talking about are till about 1798. And what we see here, if we do this map overlay, is the map that's drawn by George Gilpin in 1798, overlain over top of the map that George Washington drew in 1749. And what you see pretty quickly is the infilling of those tidal flats, those 5-foot deep tidal muddy area of the crescent-shaped bay of Alexandria, and essentially completely transforming the river's edge. And we'll talk a little bit more about why, because it's a monumental feat to create 10 city blocks that did not previously exist out of earth and using derelict ship hulls. This is an artist's rendition of what the port of Alexandria would have looked like in about 1760. The artist is one who works at our Torpedo Factory Art Center, and she worked very closely with the archaeologists who were there in the 1980s to come up with this artist's depiction. And what it depicts, you can see these larger boats are out in the deeper channel of the Potomac River. And then you see smaller boats, and their job is to ferry the cargo back and forth between the edge of the water and the boats, and sort of going back and forth and ferrying those that cargo. And that really is not efficient. And if Alexandria wants to be a preeminent port along the eastern seaboard and in the Chesapeake Bay, that is not going to work. It's just simply too slow and not economically feasible. And so that's really the incentive, was to create this new land, to create a more usable port to draw people into the city, and merchants and goods. That in the use of enslaved and indentured labor was part of this land making process is very clear. We have just a few historic documents that talk about putting the earth into the tidal flats to make new land. It was really common, and people didn't really concern themselves with writing it down in their diaries. So it's very poorly documented, this process, which we think happens mainly in the 1780s and 1790s. But every once in a while, we get a glimpse. In particular, I'll read to you this glimpse from the newspaper. This is in 1785. The Alexandria Gazette reports, Last week, as a Negro man was digging under the bank, unfortunately, a large mass of earth fell upon him and fractured his thigh. There's another report a few weeks later of a bank falling on top of an indentured servant and actually killing him. So this is hard, backbreaking work to pull these steep banks that measured about 15 to 20 feet high, to pull that earth by cart, by horse and cart down into the mudflats and start creating land. And that's essentially what people did. It wasn't directed by the town, but it was incentivized by the town. So if you built land, you got to keep the land you built, the land you made. And so it's really every individual landowner for themselves kind of buying these water's edge parcels and building their land out into the Potomac River. And thinking about the labor that essentially did that. Here's what Alexandria looks like by 1804. This is a map done of the city in that year. And you can see that they've really had some successes to the point where they've labeled and named the individual wharves where ships are coming into to unload their cargo. Alexandria does a very brisk business in the trade of the transatlantic world. At least by after the Revolutionary War into the first few decades of the 1800s. Alexandria is most often trading with the mid-Atlantic, so places like Philadelphia, that's our main back and forth traffic, but also over to Europe, particularly in England, and down to the Caribbean. So there are ships coming from all over the globe into the port of Alexandria, and they've really started to benefit and capitalize on the creation of the new land. Just a side note, Alexandria is not a major port of the transatlantic slave trade, but it does become a major hub of the domestic slave trade in the 1830s and 1840s. And so we don't have a lot of ships coming directly from Africa. I think there's only one or two that are known in the historic record during this period. But after the slave trade shifts to the sale of domestic enslaved people, that's a big part of Alexandria's history that we are working very hard to preserve and interpret. Okay, so I know I said at the beginning that we were going to get back to the discussion of our Archaeological Protection Code, because that really explains why the archaeology was done and why the archaeologists found what they found. So we have another overlay map here. The map in the background is another one that George Washington draws himself in 1748, so before they've laid out the whole street grid. And we've overlain it with the modern shoreline. And that's the black line that you see to the east, right here. We've got the names of the streets labeled here on the modern street grid. And in the early 2000s, there were two developers that came forward with projects that were part of an effort to revitalize Alexandria's waterfront and bring new use and new energy and new development to Old Town. The first project that was proposed is here in red, and that was the Hotel Indigo site. So it was a site that was going to become a hotel. And the other site is the what we call the Robinson Landing site. And that was an entire block that was going to become a mixed-use residential development. And so as part of our role as archaeologists in Alexandria, we reviewed those two plans and we gave those developers a preliminary archaeological assessment. Essentially, we said to them, there is a high potential to find archaeological resources on both of these sites, simply by the fact that you're straddling original ground and made land. And we also had a high degree of suspicion that the warehouses from the Washington Post. So the Washington Post newspaper used to have two big warehouses at the Robinson Landing site that were built on a slab of concrete. And in urban archaeology terms, that's almost often caps a lot of archaeological resources below it, even in a city that's changed and evolved over 250 years. We gave them the heads up that they would likely find archaeology there. What we didn't know was what's the state of the preservation of what might be there. It may have gotten disturbed in the 20th century by some of those industrial activities. We just didn't know. So the developers were required, per our code, to hire archaeologists to do these two sites, which fall within our historic district, which is the third oldest historic district in the country. This photograph is taken from the river from a Coast Guard helicopter who flew by and took a photograph of these archaeological sites kind of as they were in progress and finished. So I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of what this space looked like as the archaeology was happening. This is the Hotel Indigo after it's been built. So that's the hotel that you can stay at and right along the river there. And this is the Robinson Landing site as it's being excavated. And in fact, it's almost completely done being excavated here. But what we found within the first few trenches was that there was actually an astounding degree of preservation at both of these sites, particularly the Robinson Landing site preserved an entire late 18th, early 19th century city block. There were privies. Everybody knows what a privy is, right? Some audiences don't anymore. So the shafts beneath an outhouse are historical archaeologists' dream features to excavate. There is an incredible degree of preservation of organic material. I'm talking seeds, I'm talking even things like whipworm and other diseases, remnants can get preserved in the soil. And of course, the night soil itself, when you get down to the very bottom of the privies. They found houses and wells. They found structures associated with storefronts and warehouses. I mean, it was just the entire early Alexandria was there on this one block because of the protection afforded by that concrete slab that the warehouses were built on. So there were all of these features, hundreds of thousands of artifacts, and the remnants of 4 derelict ship hulls. And that's what, if you see the yellow stars that popped up, that shows the relative location of where those ships were located. So there was 1 at the Hotel Indigo site, and then 3 down here at this Robinson Landing site. So the next spoiler that I'm going to tell you is this is not a story of underwater archaeology either. These were terrestrially buried ships. They didn't need scuba divers to excavate them as most of the underwater archaeology happens. And that's what becomes so exciting is when we started to work with some underwater archaeologists to help us excavate these remains. But let me back up and talk a little bit more about land making, because while it sounds boring, the archaeology of it is actually incredibly interesting. This term, ships as vernacular architecture, was originally coined by an archaeologist named Dr. Ben Ford. He's an underwater archaeologist, and he has studied throughout the world this idea of reused vessels. What happens to a ship, any kind of ship, after it goes through its life, if it hasn't been sunk or blown up or caught fire? What happens to them? You know, maybe they get dismantled and reused, but ships only have about a 40-year lifespan in the colonial period. And so he has seen that in a lot of places across the world, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Bermuda, down to South America, this idea of adapting to your environment and using already built piece of architecture to help you with this local adaptation or this local challenge, which was building out new land. And so what these people did when they had their ships that had sailed for maybe about 40 years is they sunk them to the bottom of the mudflats, and then they started to build wharves on top of them. And that's what you see happening. There's a wharf here on the stern end of this ship. There's a wharf here on the stern end of this ship, and even this ship on the right, we've already dismantled the wharf by the time this photo was taken, but they're all kind of built into a superstructure that was then filled in with earth and rocks to create all of this new land. So the discovery of these 4 ships was significant both because they told us about land making, which is a largely undocumented process, but also because they tell us about these everyday workaday merchant ships that we really don't know much about. And if you think about, if you've been to a museum and learned about a shipwreck, it's usually a naval wreck or associated with war. You know the name of the ship. In the American History Museum in the Smithsonian, you can go see the gunboat Philadelphia, which is an incredible Revolutionary War ship that was sunk and retrieved and put on exhibit. But these are the everyday ships of working people, working merchants. And that's usually the contribution of archaeology to history. Is I don't find George Washington's name in the ground, but we find his vision of his landscape. We find the use of these pieces of ships as part of everyday architecture. So really our archaeology is about the everyday, and that's what was found here. So I'll take you step by step through this, what we've been calling the Ships Project, affectionately calling the Ships Project, as I hope people are calling me affectionately the lady with the ships. Just heard a lot lately. So this is the photographs of the first ship that was found at the Hotel Indigo site. It was found in late 2015 and excavated in early 2016. What remained was not the entire hull, but a remnant that was about 47 feet long by 13 feet wide. So a pretty substantial piece of this ship. From dendrochronology, or the science of tree ring dating, we were able to ascertain that the timbers that were felled to build this ship were cut down sometime after 1741. And then they grew originally in Massachusetts. So that raises the question, was this ship built in Massachusetts and ultimately met its end in Alexandria? Or was it built in Alexandria with lumber imported down from Boston? That either case could be true. That's a hard one to figure out. We'll never know the name of this ship. No one ever wrote down, I sunk a ship outside my parcel today, and it was called this before I sunk it. So that will probably never be known. But what these photographs show is the real true nature of urban archaeology. We're rarely out there with trowels and toothbrushes and paintbrushes and digging delicately. We're out there with backhoes and excavators. We're wearing hard hats and safety vests and safety goggles. And that's incredibly true with what we did with this ship, which was take the pieces apart timber by timber. But that couldn't be done with hands. They're built to last. So we needed the strength of the excavator to help pry and pull the timbers apart so that we could transport them into tanks of water at a city warehouse. This is wood that was preserved in the mud in an anaerobic environment, so an oxygen-free environment, and under the water table. So the water was really holding these ships together when they were found. So it was paramount that we excavate them as quickly as possible and get them resubmerged into water so that they didn't start to disintegrate. And when I say we, let me tell you about our team. So we have archaeologists for the City of Alexandria, but the developer hires an archaeological contracting firm to help with the work because our staff is too small. We can't be taking on all of this work throughout the city. So they hire archaeologists to do the work. But this was such a special case that we had to bring in a conservator, an archaeological conservator who knows not only how to preserve waterlogged 250-year-old wood, but also how to dismantle these ships. And in fact, there's a woman at the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab named Nicole Daub, and her specialty is well, it's archaeological conservation, but she's, I think at this point, dismantled and done this process with about 8 ships, including the ship that was found in the wreckage of the World Trade Center, which is a Revolutionary War era ship that was used in the land making process of New York. So she's the one in the foreground in the tank with her waders on there. We also worked closely with our peers and our colleagues at the Naval History and Heritage Command, because they have underwater archaeologists on staff that are used to seeing ships. What they're not used to is seeing ships on land, like archaeological ships on land. So we needed them to tell about how underwater archaeologists record their finds, and they needed us to tell them how you deal with archaeology on land. And so it was really a very helpful, productive partnership. The developer was Car City Centers, and the archaeological firm who did the majority of the work up until the city took ownership of the ship is called Wetland Studies and Solutions. Okay, so we did it. We got the timbers in the water. They sat there for 1.5 years while we devised a plan, what was going to happen next. And that required a lot of talking to other city staff and working through a plan. And then eventually these timbers were moved to Texas A&M University's Conservation Research Lab in 2017. They were packaged into wooden crates. They were all wrapped up like Christmas presents, so they wouldn't lose any moisture on their long journey to Texas. And they were driven in a tractor trailer all the way to College Station. We received a grant from the National Park Service's National Maritime Heritage Grant to help support the majority of the funding for the conservation component of the project. And part of the grant that we wrote was asking to fund a trip for some of our Alexandria Archaeology team to go down to the lab and to see it happening in progress. And to also see an example of where this had been done before, where a ship had been conserved and ultimately reassembled and put on exhibit. And so here we are learning about conservation. That's my colleague Ben Skolnick peering into a vat of water filled with these 18th century ship timbers that have to go a really slow and steady conservation process. I can get really into the science of it, but suffice it to say that if these were allowed to dry out, the water would evaporate and the cellular structures of the wood would collapse. So what you need is something to fill in and replace the water inside the cellular structure of the wood so that it can come out into the air and not blow up and fall apart. And this is a process of conservation that's been perfected. If you've ever heard of the Mary Rose or the Vasa, the gunboat Philadelphia, they've been working on this conservation process for years. And what they've determined is that you can't just spray the timbers with a substance called polyethylene glycol, which is a waxy substance. It's actually, if you start looking in household products, you'll see it everywhere. It's in Miralax. It is what will ultimately replace the cellular structure of the wood so that it doesn't fall apart. But the timbers need to be soaked in it. They can't just be sprayed with it. That's one thing that they've learned over all these years. The next thing that they've learned in doing this is that the final stage of the process has to be putting these timbers into a freeze dryer. This photograph is of the world's largest archaeological freeze dryer that they have down there in Texas. And it can fit these timbers, and that's the last stage, is taking out any of that remnant water and ensuring that there's nothing that's going to cause these timbers to decay from the inside out at the end of the process. So we had to get our picture made in front of the world's largest archaeological freeze dryer. And then the next thing we did was take a trip to Austin, to the State Museum. It's called the Bullock Museum, and see the exhibit called La Belle, which is a 17th century French shipwreck, part of La Salle's expedition looking for the mouth of the Mississippi River. They come into a catastrophic storm, the boat sinks, and is found hundreds of years later by underwater archaeologists. They excavate it and they conserve it, and ultimately it's the feature artifact when you walk into that museum. It's incredible. It's an incredible museum. They have an exhibit of all of the artifacts that were also found within the ship when it sank, because it was filled with cargo to provision a new city. So, or a new fort. So you can see that on exhibit there. And what we wanted to do was have them walk us through the process of what we hope will ultimately become the destiny of the ship from the Hotel Indigo site, which is reassembly in a custom-made steel cradle rather, and put on exhibit so people can learn about ship making, merchant activity, and also about Alexandria's history. So these just give you an idea of what we're kind of envisioning with the reconstructed ship. This is the La Belle in Texas. Many of you may have been to or heard about the Viking Museum in Denmark, where they have done this with ships, the Viking ships that have been found. And if you're ever in Quebec City, in the Museum of Civilization, their front artifact is a French bateau from the 18th century that's been conserved and put on exhibit. So these are our this is our inspiration board here, what we're looking for. In the meantime, in order to keep the energy and the interest up about that first ship that was found, we worked with the underwater archaeologists at Texas A&M to come up with a 1:12 scale model and to really digitally document the timbers and create a computer model that can be studied and manipulated in a way that those timbers really can't be, and to kind of go through the process of reconstructing the ship, at least by 3D printed material. So let me tell you what we're looking at here. This is the ship. So this is the bow. The bow was present, and the starboard side is missing. So we don't also have the full length of the ship. The ship was probably about 70 71 feet when it sailed. So it was a medium-sized ship. It had been pretty well stripped of anything that would be useful in a house, or even pieces of wood that might be reused somewhere in Alexandria. So it had been stripped down, but this is what was left. And then what the model maker, Glenn Greco, did was create what we conjecture the hull would have looked like, which starts to give you an idea of the amount of cargo it could have held, the original length and size, and possibly what type of ship. And so that's what he's working on in this photograph. And this is our featured artifact in our museum right now. It's part of an exhibit. And I really like it because what it really to me shows, even beyond what we have learned about the ship, is what archaeologists do. So we find a piece, a remnant of the past. We bring in comparative information, historic period documentation, and make our best interpretation, whether that's an archaeological site or a feature or an artifact or a ship. That's what we do. So just when we had come up with our plan for the ship from the Hotel Indigo site, the archaeologists called and said they found another ship at the site just 1 block south. So by the end of 2018, we had 4 ships within 2 city blocks that were fully documented and excavated. And I wanted to put the image on the top left-hand corner there to show you that we used traditional documentation when we were in the field, so hand drawing and maps, but we also utilized photogrammetry and LiDAR, digital ways of 3D documenting the ships as they were being excavated. As each layer was being dismantled, we did another round of LiDAR or another round of photogrammetry to make sure we have this as best documented as can be, because these ships could not stay in the ground. And so that's a question that I get often is, why didn't you just leave them there? And they were happy to be there for 250 years. But both of these developments called for parking garages, 2-story deep parking garages. So nothing archaeological was going to stay in the ground there. It all had to come out. And it had to come out quickly so that it didn't get decayed too much during the excavation process. So this is the ship that was first found at the Hotel Indigo site. These 3 are the additional 3 ships. These are all done in relationship to the ever increasing shoreline, the ever growing shoreline. So this is the original shoreline that George Washington draws. This is the George Gilpin shoreline. We don't think he does quite a detailed job, because the dendrochronology of the wharf wood that was on top of this ship dates to the 1780s. So we think that all of these ships are in the ground probably by the end of the 1700s. And then we see there's an even more shoreline activity expansion as of 1845. So this gives you an idea of the relationship. This one, for example, is very close to that original shoreline. So you might speculate that that one went in the ground first. That's what that map shows. As I talked about, we have to work with backhoes and excavators to dismantle these timbers. We had other city staff from General Services and our Transportation and Environmental Sciences helping us. This is really, really back-breaking work. Waterlogged wood is incredibly heavy. Conserved wood is incredibly light. So we're looking forward to the other end of this project to see what that looks like. But this just gives you a little bit of a feel of the kind of work that we were undertaking. Oh, and I just want to go back one slide. So this ship looks kind of funny. This is the bow of this ship. And you see there's what looks like a concrete wall on 2 sides of it. That's because that is the wall that was put in to create a barrier around the parking garage to ensure that they could properly dewater it from a construction standpoint. And it cuts through the ship. So this ship is actually partially preserved under the foot of Wolf Street. We took out all that was within the bounds of the construction site, which is an incredibly substantial proportion. And there is some left in the ground in the future should archaeologists want to explore it. Okay, so we talked about that slide. The next thing that we did was a similar process to the process with the Hotel Indigo ship timbers, which was a round of digital documentation. In this case, we had the archaeologists from Texas A&M come to Alexandria and bring their laser scanning technology with them. So they have a ferro laser arm, which is what you see the archaeologists holding here. And they're going around and they're documenting every single side of the timber so that they can create a 3D model of all 1,180 timbers from these 3 ships. It was a lot. It was the hardest I've ever worked as an archaeologist, and it was not in the dirt. So we worked very closely with them to remove these timbers piece by piece from these pop-up pools. So if you've ever seen those backyard pools that kind of pop up in the summertime, you can buy them off Amazon. We bought 9 of them off Amazon to house over 1,000 historic ship timbers in a city warehouse to keep them wet. I mean, that is really the critical part. At first, we were using big dumpsters like the rain for rent type dumpsters, but that's actually more of an expense than it is to buy these pop-up pools and use them this way. So we had them all laid out. If you go to our YouTube page, you can actually watch it. We had Wetlands do some trial runs of their new drone, come to the warehouse and fly over the the warehouse and fly over the timbers in their pools. That on our YouTube page, you can check that out. So the idea was, let's document these as thoroughly as possible because of their significance, and ensure that we've gotten all the information that we can. And so that has ended up producing 4 1:12 scale models of these ships and 4 digital models of the ships after they've been reassembled. And so let me talk to you a little bit about what the maritime archaeologists have been able to interpret from a very close analysis of the shape and the size of these ships. So this was the first one found from the Hotel Indigo site. These are the other 3. This is the one that was cut by that slurry wall or that bentonite wall. So this is not a natural break. These were all cut by an axe sometime in the 18th century, and you can see axe marks. Ben Ford, in his look at vernacular architecture and ships, suggests that the size that you usually see of a reused vessel is about 50 feet long. So there was something to the manageability of them, not just in Alexandria, but throughout the world. And that's what you see with these 3 anyway. This one is the smallest ship. That's B here. It would have been what underwater archaeologists call a lighter, or one of those ferry ships that went back and forth, taking the cargo, mainly goods being imported into Alexandria and beyond, from places like Philadelphia or across the Atlantic Ocean in England. These 2, and this one would have been about 50 feet long when it sailed. So we had almost all of it in its length. Could have carried about 37 tons of cargo. The other 2 ships are mid-sized merchant ships. They would have been about 60 to 70 feet when they sailed and could have carried about 90 to 100 tons. They could have easily gone across the Atlantic Ocean. If you've ever seen those tiny ships down at the Jamestown settlement, they sailed pretty small ships across the ocean. So these were bigger than those. And then the 3rd ship from the Robinson Landing site is the largest excavated merchant ship, period. It is about 102 feet long when it sailed and could have carried about 260 tons of cargo. It was a really big ship. It was a really hard ship to dismantle and to properly place and preserve in those timbers in those tubs of water. So we've done our work as archaeologists here. We've put 1 off to conservation. We have 3 in short-term storage in the pools. We've done all the documentation that can be done to our modern standards. We've made models. We've done tons of public outreach. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But what we needed was a solution for what to do with the 3 ships that were in pools of water. That is just not a sustainable long-term storage solution. It's a great short-term storage solution, but city staff had to go out and replace the water quite frequently. We had to make sure that they were being kept properly, that no one accidentally put a hole in the side of one of the tanks. It was really a large investment of staff time. And Alexandria is a small city and they needed the space. They needed that warehouse back for what it used to be used for. So here's where our Archaeological Commission comes in. I said at the beginning, they're one of our main partners, particularly in a project like this, which is to work with the community to come up with some possible solutions. They, as these ships were being excavated, formed a ships subcommittee of the Archaeological Commission. So that was a smaller group that would get together every week for a while, but then it became every other week and talk about the educational value and the public value of these ships, to talk about all the possibilities from do they get thrown away all the way through, do they get fully conserved, and then what's in between. They invited curators from the Smithsonian to come down and talk with us. We gave them presentations on our trip to Austin, Texas. We really worked together as a team of city staff and the public to come up with this next phase, which is all ponding for preservation. And so what we were able to do, and also working with Nicole at the Mac Lab, is understand that there is a medium-term solution that we could embark on. And that is putting them in the bottom of a pond, a waterlogged environment, where they could be secured to the bottom and kept safe, but retain the possibility for future study or future conservation. No one was willing on that scale to throw them away. They're simply too significant and we had done too much work. We weren't willing to fully conserve them because that would cost millions of dollars and assumes that you have a place to put them on exhibit, which we don't at the moment. Then assumes you have a place to put them in storage, which we also don't, above water storage, which we don't at the moment. And so we talked with our partner at the Mac Lab, and she had recently undertaken a similar project with only 67 timbers, mind you, but there was a ship that was found when a bridge was being constructed over the Nanticoke River in Maryland. It was a Revolutionary War era ship that had sunk, and they took it up and they documented it and they 3D scanned it and made a model. And then they resubmerged the timbers in a pond at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, which is a state museum. And she said that is a possibility for these. So then it required working with our staff in Parks and Rec and Department of Project Implementation and Transportation and Environmental Services to make sure that we could assess every risk possible to do this and thought through every possible implication for what putting historic timbers at the bottom of a city pond might mean. And it was a really rewarding experience to have people of many different disciplines come around and come around an archaeological project and work together and come up with this solution. And so that's what you see on the bottom slide here is the location of those timbers within a city stormwater pond. So it's not a natural pond, it's man-made. It's at one of our most popular parks in the city. So I spent almost every Saturday of my life at this baseball field because my son plays baseball. And the timbers are there, but we knew that we couldn't do this project by ourselves. It's simply too much material. We contracted with an archaeological contracting company called AECOM. They're a large engineering firm that also has scientific divers and underwater archaeologists on staff. And we said we would provide some of the labor, but we need your help to do all this work. And then the Maryland Conservator helped us come up with a scope of work, which required wrapping each timber up like a Tootsie Roll, securing the ends with zip ties. And this is in a material, a geotextile that will hinder biological growth on the timbers. So algae and plants and things don't start growing on them. We also then re-tagged each individual timber. We put another label on them so we will know if somebody goes out there in 25 years and pulls up a timber, they'll know exactly where that timber was located on the ship before it was dismantled. And like I said, these timbers are too heavy out of the water to carry by hand. So this was facilitated by a forklift. I have, I think, about 500 hours of forklift driving under my belt at this point. So here is our first load of timbers that have been loaded onto the trailer, secured down with straps, and they're being driven about 3 miles from the warehouse down Duke Street to Ben Brenman Pond. And you can see the pools in the background. And then it'll pan over and you'll see the archaeologists rolling out the next roll of the geotextile so that we can cut it up to size and Tootsie Roll wrap the timbers and then forklift them onto the trailer. This was our process. Now, the other end of the process required people on the receiving end in the pond and kind of facilitating this movement. So we had a forklift with a telescopic arm that could get the timbers off of the trailer and then extend the arm out to the very edge of the pond where the scientific divers were ready. So none of them are in their scuba suits right now. So this photograph is taken as they're loading up their floating dock. They use the floating dock to move the timbers around to the location in the pond where they would be sunk by the scuba diver and attached to a geogrid down on the bottom of the pond and secured down. And so they're the ones that are in the pond directing the timbers, come this way, we'll sink it and bring it down. Okay, and then here you can see one of the scientific divers. She's helping to push the floating dock out into the center of the pond, and she'll then get ready to gear up and take one timber at a time down to secure it on the bottom. And you can see this one is a full load here, right? They've got all these timbers that they're ready to submerge. Okay, here's another video. So watch this one here. You'll see the bubbles. So that scuba diver has just gone down under the surface of the water, and they're going to hand the diver the next timber. You'll notice the buoys, the pool noodles there with the rope. That's what shows the edges of this geogrid. It's a type of material that's used in bridge construction. It's marking the edges of each of the 3 geogrids so that if there was ever a will to take up one ship, just one ship, you could do that. We've marked with GPS the corners of the geogrid. And then our state underwater archaeologist came out with his kayak and did side scan sonar. So we have side scan sonar imagery of the bottom of the pond as well. And this is just one of my favorite photos because this is if a scuba diver is giving an A-OK, that's just showing everything's good. It's coming along as we expected. This took about a month of work to get the timbers down on the bottom of the pond, but we did it in the time frame that we had allotted, and we did it under budget, and it was really an incredibly successful effort on the part of everyone that was involved, including our Archaeological Commission members. And here, so you can't on this pond drive like any motorized, well, first of all, you can't swim, you can't fish. It's a city stormwater pond. You can't take a boat out, you can't swim, you can't do anything in the water. And so they had to use a system of pulling a rope to move the floating dock around to get the timbers where they needed to be. And then the scientific diver is waving at us right there. So there were concerns about climate change and evaporation, like the lowering the water level. So we made sure that there was, I think, at least 2 feet to 3 feet of water over top of the highest timber that's down. The water is very shallow here. It's only about 8 feet deep at its deepest. There were concerns that the timbers might displace the water in the pond and kind of cause it to flood out. So we made those calculations as well. We really went through all of those steps of not just assessing risk, but then going out into the community and talking to civic associations around the pond that consider that their backyard and making sure that they were comfortable with the project and understood its components as well. And then, yeah, this is the glory ship, the floating dock that helped with all the work and the archaeologists that made it happen. This ship's project has caught a lot of attention in the media. I think there's something very exciting for people to see historic ships. I think there's a real connection there to our more seafaring days when we were more connected to the water. We had a reporter from the New York Times come down and do a lengthy interview and a lengthy project on the ship's project. And what's actually photographed there, you can see on the left-hand side, one day in April, so this would have been in April 2018, I think, we had a public viewing day. There was such interest from residents in coming to see the archaeological work, but you can't walk on the site. It's too urban and there's just too much construction activity happening. But the developer was happy to help us arrange a public viewing day. We had 3,000 people come down to the foot of Wolf Street to see this ship and the other remnants that were visible. We had archaeologists from our nonprofit, Friends of Alexandria Archaeology group out there helping us interpret and talk about the discovery, and just making sure everybody felt like they had the opportunity to see it and understand it. And we did the same thing with the ship from the Hotel Indigo site as well. And then the ponding project, as we call it, caught the attention of American Archaeology magazine. And so they had a reporter come out with us for a day to learn more about this innovative storage solution is what we were talking about. I think inside the magazine, he calls it creative conservation. So it's a pretty unique way to manage cultural heritage. It's something that doesn't happen as often in the United States as it does in Europe. Resubmergence or reburial is very common in Europe. It's just not practiced here very often. So this is one of the few times that it's been done, and people are really looking to learn more about its success. And then one of the things that is one of our 3 C's, the community part, is just ensuring that people have access to understanding the story and the journey of the ships from 250 years ago in Old Town out to Ben Brenman Pond. So we have 3 historic interpretation signs that are outside the pond that talk about the journey of the ships. If people want more information, we also talk about it a lot in our museum as well. But putting history where it happened and making sure that people know that now there's an archaeological site at the bottom of Ben Brenman Pond is a really important part of the project. So let me move into my what's next component here. What we're working on, at least in terms of the ponding project, is implementing a monitoring plan. So like I said, this is a medium-term storage solution. It's meant to last about 25 years, at which point we've requested that the city reconsider and reanalyze and evaluate this solution. Now, it may continue on, but what we're going to do in the meantime is take some data on the condition of the timbers in the pond, which will require scientific divers to come out at the 1 year and then at every 5 years for the next 25 years. So we did our 1 year condition assessment. Overall, the curation plan is working as intended. So they had divers go and pull up a few timbers that were flagged for monitoring. We brought those up, we unwrapped them. We did a few tests to make sure that the wood wasn't rapidly decaying or seeing a lot of biological growth or anything that would, I don't know, alarm us essentially. Also, the good news is that a protective layer of silt has started to accumulate, because ideally these would be in the bottom of a very muddy pond. And that process has started to already happen, which is great. So a nice layer, a nice blanket of silt is starting to accumulate, and the sample timbers are in very good condition. And so we'll be out there again in 2028 to do the 5-year monitoring. In general, we've been doing a lot of archaeology outreach related to this waterfront archaeology and ships project. And we've been working with developers to do it as well. So this, in the top left-hand side of this slide, this is an archaeological drawing of the ship that was found at the Hotel Indigo site. And the hotel was really excited to anchor their new hotel in history. And so they took that drawing, I think that Ed did. Yeah. And they had a graphic designer kind of trace over it. And there's their entryway graphic when you go into their foyer of their hotel. Down to the level where they've even replicated the numbering system that we used to number the frames and futtocks, or the ribs of the ship. So that's really one way to anchor this redeveloping waterfront in history. Another thing that we worked with our museum educator to do was to develop a ship science lesson. This is a lesson that we offer for free to Alexandria City Public School students and for a small fee to other schools around in the area, where you learn about the science of tree ring dating and how you use that science to potentially date the timbers of a ship. it's a fun lesson that is very STEM focused and that can be taken apart and used in different components like science nights at schools and other activities. Actually, I think adults like it more than kids do. We find that with a lot of our hands-on activities, actually. So we just did a science night about 3 weeks ago, and the parents were using these sticks that they're holding. These are their dendrochronology samples. They're just beads, light and dark beads. So they're using those to match up with samples that have been previously taken. And the adults were getting really into it. It's like, you had to move over. Let the kids come up. So that's one of the things that has been very successful. Another activity that we have is one that we like to bring out to fairs and festivals and outdoor activities because it's a giant mess. But we essentially allow people to recreate what they think the wharves and the infrastructure would have looked like when people were making new land. So we have Lincoln logs, and you can kind of build your structure. You could fill it in with sand, and then we pour the Potomac River into it and see if your land making structure can withstand a heavy flood event on the Potomac. And so that's my daughter Nora there. It's her favorite activity. But it does create a big mess, so we don't bring it out to every single thing we do. This is the torpedo factory where our museum is located. And there's a really big public art installation, a temporary public art installation that happens in Waterfront Park just outside of it. And I think almost all, with the exception of 2 exhibits, the artist has found their inspiration in Alexandria's history. And some of them have found their inspiration in the ships and in land making. And some are more inspired to think about the experience of African Americans in Alexandria. That's what this art installation is of. And so we see a lot of this, of infusing our ever-changing and redeveloping city with history and with waterfront history. We recently also just had an exhibit at the Robinson Landing development site, which is now built, called The Buried Ships of Robinson Landing, where we displayed the 3 1-to-12 scale models, just to keep those present in people's minds and to interpret that story there. But the one thing that we're still working on is finding a location for the exhibition of the ship from the Hotel Indigo site. So we've been talking closely with the conservators there, and they're estimating that the ship will return to Alexandria in 2027. So in about 2 years, it'll be done freeze drying, taken out and put back on a tractor trailer and driven to Alexandria. And the question is, can a suitable exhibition location be found in the meantime, or will the timbers go into storage? Probably that's the most likely, until a suitable location is found. And that's hard to do in a small city, to exhibit a 50-foot long artifact. And so it's required a lot of creative thinking, and we're always looking for new ideas and talking to people about potential in different kinds of spaces. And we'll be continuing to focus on waterfront archaeology as other projects come up that are related over the coming years. And so that's all the PowerPoint slide. Yeah, that's all the PowerPoint slides that I have for tonight. But I'm happy to answer questions and on Zoom or in person. And yeah, go ahead. Oh, that's such a good question. Let's go back. So yeah, there's so many details here. Let me see the best picture. I think it's of the ships. So the joinery, you can kind of see it in this photograph the best. So do you see these very tall things sticking up? These are the bolts, the pins that are going through the keelson, which is the inside longitudinal timber that runs the length of the ship. And you need to pin the keelson to the frames, to the planks, and then to the keel, the spine of the ship, essentially. It does appear that they used iron bolts or pins to do that, though most of these ships are held together with trunnels or wooden pegs. They were early on called tree nails because they're made of wood, but eventually they start to call them trunnels. And those are actually a genius way to fasten a ship, because once they get a little wet, they start to expand, and the tightness of that closure is pretty incredible. There are smaller iron nails used throughout the the ship as well to, for example, fasten the ceiling planking to the frames and futtocks. So we did see iron, but I would say the main fastener are these wooden pegs or wooden trunnels. And you see that in house architecture too. If you ever go down to the basement of an 18th century, early 19th century house, you can see that it's held together by these wooden pegs. So that's a good question. Yeah, all the way in the back.
Here's the notes that were your table, but did you have to, because it was a man-made pond that they were submerged in, did you have to worry about what organisms in the pond or what organisms in the ships? I mean, the cross-contamination, what?
Yeah. Yes, we did. We sent samples of the ship timbers to an environmental company to ascertain that there would be nothing in them that would negatively impact the environment in the pond. So we did that. That was one of the first things we did, because that would have ruled out a lot of, reburial, resubmersion options. And when that came back, that there was not a potential for these to leach out heavy metals or any kind of chemicals that would have been in them, then we knew we could proceed to explore these options. The conservator was the one who said, archaeological artifacts have been through a lot, and there's probably not a lot in this environment other than the things that we can protect from, which is biological growth by doing the wrapping. She's like, there's probably not a lot that can really hamper these and harm them in any way. So yeah, we did think about that. And yeah, thanks for reminding me. Go ahead.
Yeah, you have a lot of flooding back into your excavation site.
Yes.
How did you handle that? What did you do with the water? Because you couldn't put it back into.
Yeah, so that was a big problem at this site. And at any slow-lying archaeological site along the Chesapeake Bay, is the water table is really high. And so the archaeologists really had to fight the water table the entire time they were out there. Like I showed you that photo of from the river of the site. The ships were like the last things to be excavated. They did most of the other work first. And at that point, they hadn't put up their slurry wall to do the dewatering. So there was the groundwater was constantly coming in. So we used those big industrial sized pumps to kind of constantly be pulling the water out and putting it into a retention area so that it wouldn't go right back into the Potomac River. And then once they dewatered the site for construction, that's when everything became very easy. It was dry and easy to excavate, but it did mean we had to go fast because we didn't have the moisture in the soil to help protect the timbers anymore. So we had to do a lot of spraying and watering like you would your lawn, spraying and watering down of the timbers as we were going. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So much the dendrochronology on this is fascinating.
Yeah.
I just have two sort of quick questions. Was this all one tree species, and is the chronology from this on the ITRDB anywhere?
So most of the timbers are made from white oak. There is some pine. There's a problem with the dendrochronology on the 3 ships from Robinson Landing. They have not been able to get conclusive results. What does that mean? Does that mean the samples weren't very good? Does it mean that the trees that these 3 ships were made from were from some microenvironment that we don't have a sample in the database? We don't really know. But that's one reason we're glad that the wood is preserved, so that hopefully maybe as dendrochronology advances or someone comes up with a new technique for dating historic wood, we can go down that. I mean, I think I've heard like isotopic analysis is getting sophisticated in the historic period. There may be a way to date them, but right now, the way we've dated the one ship is because we know that the timbers, we were able to get dendrochronology samples from the wharf on top of that ship, and that helped us kind of get a relative date, but otherwise we don't have a lot. And yeah, the reports, so all of the archaeological reports that are done in Alexandria are in our online bibliography, and all the dendrochronology reports are there. So you can go and read and figure out where the data are. But yeah, good question. And the dendrochronologist saves the samples too. He still has them. So yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering, after the ship is conserved, Does it still, when you have it on display, will it need to be in a climate controlled environment?
Yeah, a museum environment, yeah. Yeah, a typical museum environment should be enough. I mean, what you're looking for is anything you would look for in another museum object is like rapid fluctuations in temperature and humidity. So the more constant it can be, the better. With historic wooden ships, the concern is always actually the iron kind of undergoing, more corrosion. Even though they've gone through a chelation process to take out all the iron, there might be some iron embedded very deeply that kind of starts to break out and cause concretions. And that is something that we would monitor for and people monitor for on these ships. But yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, but people have asked, couldn't they be exhibited outside in a park? Yeah, they couldn't. They wouldn't last in that environment, right?
There is some questions.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
How many men would have worked on the larger merchant ship? I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a really good question. I'll have to look that up. Hey, maybe Cindy, I could send her an email.
Yes.
Great. Okay, cool.
Cindy's our vice president. So.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, the second question is, how was it determined that the first ship's timbers came from Massachusetts? So that's because the dendrochronologist made a match between the samples of the timbers from that ship, and the match showed the date, and because trees grow at different rates and in different environments, that characteristic is embedded in their growth rings. And once you find the location, you can match the growth rings in the timber up with a sample in their database. And that's what happened for Massachusetts. And to accomplish this major project, how many individuals were involved and what expertise did they need to have? I really like this question. And, I should say this project is still going on. We do think and talk about it a lot. And I would say we had engineers and archaeologists and project planners, developers, attorneys. I'm trying to think of who, conservators, underwater archaeologists. Yeah, all involved in the excavation and kind of the planning of the project. I think we had our natural resources person on our kind of staff committee as well. So it was really an interdisciplinary group, and their expertise varied. It depended on what question we needed to have answered. So how big of a trailer can you drive down this street in Alexandria? Or how long can we stay and squat in this warehouse that they need to house the snow removal equipment in the city, and those kinds of things. So it really gave us an opportunity to work closely with our colleagues that we don't always necessarily work with, which was a joy. And then also worked with people both inside and outside the city, which always brought really smart and creative perspectives to whatever the challenge was. Archaeology is mainly problem solving. And sometimes you're a better archaeologist when you bring more voices into that problem solving conversation than just archaeologists. So I would say this project absolutely benefited from that.
Hey, so we are going to do our book drawing that we do. We're going to ask Dr. Breen to draw that. We have 2 books on historic archaeology of basically colonial America and Small Things Forgotten in Archaeology of Early American Life. One of my favorite books on archaeology still, even though I switched what I study now to Early Medieval Britain. Great book. And we also have Historical Archaeology by Charles Orser and Brian Fagan. Another great book. So get your tickets, please. And just draw one and then read out the numbers.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. Okay, it's 866334.
Oh. Okay.
Ooh, nice. Yeah, excellent book.
I missed like my.
And the second ticket here.
Okay, this one is 866-328. 328?
All right.
Yes.
Okay, so this is our last talk of the year. We will resume in September. Hope to see you all then. And if we can all please thank Dr. Breen for a really excellent talk.
Thank you.
Makes me think, what if I had stayed?